Every man reaches a point where he realizes power can't fill the emptiness inside. For Alpha King Davor, that moment came when he accepted what appeared to be a worthless omega as payment from a defeated village. The 47-year-old king had spent decades building his empire through strength and fear. The northern rebellion was finally crushed, and the villagers offered him their usual tribute: gold, land, livestock. Then they presented Elenwyn, a red-haired Omega woman they claimed had no value or family. Davor accepted her without much thought. She seemed ordinary, humble, broken by war like so many others. The village elders assured him she was nothing special, just another mouth to feed. They couldn't have been more wrong. Hidden beneath her quiet demeanor was a secret that would shake his kingdom to its core: royal blood and a fortune beyond. Imagination. How long can you hide a princess in a king's court? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stone halls of Blackmoor Stronghold had witnessed 47 years of Davor's life, yet they felt colder now than when he'd first claimed them as a young alpha. The morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the war room, where he stood examining reports from his latest campaign. His fingers traced the edges of his battle-worn crown, a simple circlet of black iron that bore the scars of countless conflicts. Unlike the ornate headpieces of southern kings, this crown spoke of practical warfare, of a ruler who led from the front lines rather than from behind palace walls. The weight of it pressed against his temples, a constant reminder of responsibilities that had consumed the better part of his adult life. 25 years of rule, and what did he have to show for it besides an ever-expanding territory and an increasingly hollow feeling in his chest? "Your Majesty," came the gruff voice of Commander Thane, his most trusted military advisor. The weathered man entered with the confident stride of someone who'd earned his position through blood and loyalty rather than birthright. "The northern tribute has arrived: gold, livestock, grain stores, and the woman they promised." Davor set down the parchment he'd been reading, a detailed account of damages from the recently quelled rebellion. The northern clans had held out longer than most, their fierce independence reminding him uncomfortably of his younger self. But independence meant nothing when faced with superior numbers and strategic planning. He'd learned that lesson long ago, just as they had learned it. "Now, the woman," he repeated, his voice carrying the weariness that had settled into his bones like winter frost. "What did they tell you about her?" Thane's scarred face showed his typical lack of enthusiasm for anything that wasn't directly related to military matters. Red hair, green eyes, perhaps 25 years of age. They claim she has no family, no value beyond what any Omega might provide. Called her a burden they were glad to be rid of, if you can believe their words. Through the narrow window, Davor could see the courtyard below where servants bustled about unloading wagons. His stronghold operated with military precision. Every person had their role, every task its proper time and place. It was a system that had served him well through decades of expansion and consolidation, yet something about accepting a woman as tribute sat uneasily with him, though he couldn't quite name why. Have her assigned quarters in the East Wing, he decided, something appropriate for her station but comfortable enough, and arrange for proper clothing. She'll have traveled hard to get here. "The East Wing, sire." Thane's eyebrows rose slightly. "The East Wing housed minor nobles and honored guests, not tribute offerings." "Are you certain?" Davor turned back to his reports, a gesture that had ended countless conversations over the years. "I'm certain." But even as Thane departed to carry out his orders, Davor found his attention wandering from the documents before him. The Northern Rebellion had been particularly brutal, families torn apart and communities scattered. The idea that they would offer one of their own as tribute suggested either desperation or calculation, and he'd learned never to underestimate the calculating nature of defeated enemies. The afternoon brought its usual parade of petitioners and advisers. Lord Garrett, his chief counsellor, presented the weekly reports on tax collection and trade, disputes with characteristic thoroughness. The man was approaching 60, his once golden hair now silver, but his mind remained sharp as his ceremonial sword. He'd served Davor's father before him and possessed an institutional memory that proved invaluable in matters of statecraft. "The harvest projections look promising," Garrett said, spreading detailed charts across the oak table that dominated the council chamber. "But we'll need to address the grain storage issues before winter. The northern territories will require additional supplies after the rebellion's destruction." Davor nodded, though his thoughts kept drifting to the woman who had arrived that morning. Something about the villagers' eagerness to be rid of her nagged at him. In his experience, people didn't willingly surrender their valuable assets, and even the most desperate rarely parted with anything that might prove useful later. "There's another matter," Garrett continued, his tone shifting to one of careful diplomacy. "Several of our neighboring kingdoms have sent inquiries about potential marriage alliances. The King of Westmere has a daughter of marriageable age, and Lord Commander Blackwood's niece would bring significant military connections." The subject of marriage alliances arose with tedious regularity, and Davor's response never varied. "My position is unchanged, Garrett. I have no interest in political marriages at this stage of my life. With respect, Your Majesty, you're 7 and 40, not 70 and 7. A strategic alliance could strengthen our position considerably, and an heir would complicate everything I've built here." Davor's voice carried a finality that his counselor recognized. "This kingdom runs efficiently because decisions can be made quickly and implemented without delay. Adding the complexities of marriage politics and potential succession disputes serves no purpose." Yet even as he spoke those familiar words, Davor wondered if his real objection lay elsewhere. He'd seen too many marriages of convenience, too many unions that brought nothing but misery to all involved. His own parents had maintained a respectful but distant relationship, their marriage serving the kingdom while leaving both partners essentially alone. The thought of replicating that arrangement held no appeal. As evening approached, the stronghold settled into its nightly routine. Guards changed shifts with practiced precision, servants completed their final tasks, and the great hall filled with the subdued conversations of those sharing the evening meal. Davor typically dined alone in his private chambers, but tonight found himself walking toward the east wing instead. The corridor leading to the guest quarters was quieter than the main sections of the stronghold, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. He paused outside the door where his newest arrival had been assigned, uncertain why he'd come or what he hoped to accomplish by checking on her personally. Through the thick oak, he could hear nothing. No weeping, no pacing, no sounds of distress that might be expected from someone torn from their home and delivered into uncertain circumstances. The silence struck him as unusual. Most people in her situation would be either breaking down or raging against their fate. This composed quiet suggested something different entirely. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What would he say? What purpose would such a visit serve beyond satisfying his own curiosity? After a moment's consideration, he turned away. Tomorrow would be soon enough to make proper introductions, but as he walked back toward his own quarters, Davor couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Elenwyn as tribute had set something in motion that would prove far more significant than anyone, including himself, had anticipated. The very stillness of her response intrigued him in ways he hadn't expected, and something in that intrigue felt like the first crack in walls he'd spent years building around his heart. The war crown sat heavily on his nightstand as he prepared for sleep, its familiar weight somehow feeling different now. Change was coming to Blackmoor Stronghold. He could sense it as surely as he could sense weather shifting in the mountains. Whether that change would prove beneficial or catastrophic remained to be seen, But after decades of routine and isolation, even uncertainty felt like a form of awakening. 3 days passed before Davor encountered the woman who would change everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the carefully constructed solitude of his life. He found her in the castle's library, a space that most of his household avoided unless specifically required to clean or maintain it. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced around shelves filled with volumes on military strategy, territorial law, and historical accounts of the realm's formation. Elenwyn sat at the carved reading table, completely absorbed in a leather-bound tome, her red hair catching the sunlight like burnished copper. What stopped Davor in the doorway wasn't her beauty, though she was undeniably lovely, but the sight of her actually reading. Not pretending to read, not simply looking at pictures, but genuinely engaged with the text before her. Her lips moved slightly as she worked through complex passages, and she occasionally made small notes on a piece of parchment with a quill she'd apparently procured from somewhere. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room with measured casualness. She looked up, startled but not frightened, and rose to offer a respectful curtsy. "Your Majesty, I apologize. I didn't realize this space was forbidden. I was simply... You were reading," he observed, moving closer to see which volume had captured her attention. The book was Castellan's Military Treatises, a dense work on defensive fortifications that even his most educated advisors found challenging. An interesting choice. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she met his gaze directly. "I find the principles of defensive architecture fascinating. The way psychological intimidation factors into design alongside practical military considerations." Davor felt something shift inside his chest, a stirring of interest that had nothing to do with duty or political calculation. When had he last had a conversation about anything beyond immediate practical concerns? When had anyone in his household demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity about subjects that went beyond their required responsibilities? "And what conclusions have you drawn?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that surprised him. "That true strength often lies in appearing vulnerable while maintaining hidden advantages," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "A fortress that looks imposing might inspire direct assault, while one that seems modest might be overlooked, allowing for strategic positioning that serves better in the long term." The observation was astute, revealing an understanding that went beyond casual reading. Davor found himself studying her more carefully, noting details he'd missed during their brief initial encounter. Her clothing, while simple, was well-fitted and showed signs of quality construction. Her posture spoke of confidence despite her circumstances. Most tellingly, her hands bore no calluses from hard labor, suggesting a background quite different from what the northern villagers had claimed. "You speak as someone with more than theoretical knowledge," he said carefully. Elenwyn's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the book's cover, and for just a moment, something flickered across. Her expression, wariness perhaps or calculation. "I've always been interested in learning, Your Majesty. My family encouraged education, even for daughters." The hesitation was subtle but unmistakable. Davor had spent decades reading people, learning to detect deception and manipulation in every form. This woman was choosing her words with care, revealing just enough truth to maintain credibility while concealing something significant. "Your family," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "The villagers indicated you had none, that you were alone in the world. They were correct in the sense that matters now," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious emotional weight of the words. "The dead cannot provide protection or support." It was a reasonable explanation, yet something about her phrasing suggested layers beneath the surface. "The dead," she'd said, "not my family is dead." A subtle difference, but one that spoke to someone, accustomed to parsing language carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss," Davor offered, though he continued to study her reactions. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your kindness in providing comfortable quarters and allowing me access to your library is more generous than I had any right to expect." The conversation felt like a careful dance, each participant revealing just enough to maintain engagement while protecting their deeper truths. Davor found the challenge invigorating in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Court conversations had become predictable exchanges of information and flattery. This felt different, intellectually stimulating and somehow charged with unspoken possibilities. "You're welcome to use the library whenever you wish," he said. "Few people take advantage of the collection, and books benefit from being read rather than simply preserved. That's very generous." Her smile was genuine, transforming her entire countenance and revealing a warmth that had been carefully hidden beneath composed politeness. "I promise not to damage anything." As she began to pack away her materials, Davor noticed the small pendant she wore, a simple piece that appeared unremarkable at first glance. But something about the metalwork seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen similar craftsmanship. Before he could examine it more closely, she tucked it beneath her dress with a gesture that appeared unconscious but felt deliberate. "Elenwyn," he said as she prepared to leave, testing how her name felt on his tongue. "Would you join me for dinner tonight? I find myself curious about your thoughts on other subjects beyond military architecture." Surprise flickered across her, the features followed by something that might have been pleasure. "I would be honored, Your Majesty." After she left, Davor remained in the library, staring at the chair where she'd sat. The morning's encounter had accomplished something he wouldn't have thought possible. It had made him genuinely eager for evening to arrive. Not because of duty or necessary obligations, but because he wanted to continue a conversation that had felt more engaging than any he'd had in months. But beneath that anticipation lay questions that demanded answers. Elenwyn was not what she appeared to be, and the northern villagers had either been deceived themselves or had deliberately misrepresented her when offering her as tribute. Either possibility suggested complications that could extend far beyond his personal interest in an intriguing woman. That afternoon, he summoned his spy master, a thin, unremarkable man named Aldrich, who had served the crown for over 15 years. If anyone could uncover the truth about Elenwyn's background, it was Aldrich. "I need you to investigate our recent arrival from the northern villages," Davor instructed, discreetly. "I want to know everything, her real background, her family, connections, why the villagers were so eager to be rid of her." Aldrich nodded with the patient understanding of someone accustomed to such requests. "Any particular urgency to this, Your Majesty?" Davor considered the question. His instinct suggested that urgency might indeed be warranted, though he couldn't yet articulate why. The pendant, her education, her careful word choices, all pointed to someone with secrets that might prove significant. "Yes," he decided, "but maintain absolute discretion. I don't want her to know she's being investigated." As evening approached, and he prepared for what promised to be an unusual dinner conversation, Davor couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Elenwyn as tribute had introduced an element into his carefully ordered world that would prove impossible to control. Whether that would ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic, he wasn't yet sure. But for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to discovering the answer. The dinner proved to be a revelation in ways Davor hadn't anticipated. He'd chosen to dine in his private chambers rather than the great hall, ostensibly for the sake of conversation, but truthfully because he wasn't ready to subject either himself or Elenwyn to the scrutiny such a public meal would generate. The room was comfortable without being ostentatious. Thick rugs over stone floors, a fireplace that cast warm light across oak furniture, and windows that looked out over the courtyard where torches had begun to flicker to life. Elenwyn arrived, precisely at the appointed time, dressed in a simple but well-fitted gown that someone, likely his head housekeeper Marta, had provided from the castle stores. The deep blue fabric complemented her coloring beautifully, and she'd arranged her hair in a style that was elegant without being elaborate. She looked comfortable in these surroundings, he noted, as if dining with kings was a familiar rather than overwhelming experience. "Thank you again for this kindness," she said, as he gestured for her to take the seat across from him. "I hope I won't disappoint your expectations for conversation." "I suspect that's unlikely," Davor replied, pouring wine from a bottle of his better vintage. "Your observations about defensive architecture were more insightful than most military discussions I've had recently." The meal began with simple fare: roasted fowl, fresh bread, vegetables from the castle gardens. Nothing elaborate, but prepared with care and presented without the ceremony that usually accompanied his dining. As they ate, their conversation ranged from books to philosophy to observations about human nature, and Davor found himself increasingly impressed by the breadth and depth of her knowledge. "You mentioned your family encouraged education for daughters," he said during a natural pause. "That's unusual in most regions I'm familiar with." Elenwyn's hand stilled briefly on her wine goblet, and he caught that same flicker of wariness he'd noticed earlier. "Some families value learning above convention," she replied carefully. "My father believed that knowledge was the most reliable. Inheritance, something that couldn't be stolen or lost to political changes." The phrasing was interesting. Political changes, not natural disasters or economic hardships. Again, he sensed layers beneath her words, references to experiences she wasn't quite ready to share. "A wise philosophy," he agreed, "though I imagine such an upbringing might have made adjustment to more traditional expectations difficult." "Perhaps," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "But adaptability is also a form of education, isn't it? Learning to survive in whatever circumstances you find yourself facing." There was steel beneath that observation, a core strength that spoke to experiences beyond what any sheltered upbringing would provide. Davor found himself genuinely curious about the story behind that strength, and increasingly certain that the northern village's account of her background contained significant omissions. As the evening progressed, he made a decision that surprised him. "I'm going to have you move to different quarters," he announced. "The East Wing is comfortable, but it's not particularly convenient for someone who might be spending time in the library or other parts of the castle." Surprise flickered across her features. "Your Majesty, that's not necessary. The rooms adjacent to the North Tower would be more suitable," he continued, overriding her objection. "Better lighting for reading, access to the gardens for fresh air, and closer to the main areas of the castle. It's more practical." What he didn't say was that the North Tower rooms were traditionally reserved for honored guests of high rank, minor, royalty, important diplomatic visitors, valued allies. Moving her there would send a clear message to his household about her elevated status, though he wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to send that message. "You're very generous," she said softly, and something in her expression suggested she understood the significance of the gesture better than he might have expected. After dinner, he walked with her through the castle corridors, pointing out various rooms and explaining some of the history of the stronghold. She asked thoughtful questions and made observations that demonstrated both intelligence and an intuitive understanding of the strategic considerations that had shaped the fortress's development. "The design emphasizes function over ornamentation," she noted as they paused near one of the main staircases. "But there's an elegance in that functionality, a kind of honest beauty in structures that are exactly what they need to be." "Not everyone appreciates that aesthetic," Davor replied. "Most visitors expect more gilding and ceremony. Perhaps they're looking for external validation of power rather than recognizing power that's confident enough to stand without decoration." The observation struck him as particularly perceptive. How many people had recognized that his deliberately understated approach to royal presentation was actually a form of strength rather than limitation when they reached her current quarters. So she could gather her belongings for the move. Davor found himself reluctant to end the evening. The conversation had been the most intellectually stimulating he'd enjoyed in months, and her company felt natural in a way that surprised him. "Tomorrow I'll have someone show you the castle grounds," he offered. "The gardens are particularly pleasant this time of year, and there are excellent views from the battlements if you're interested in seeing how the defensive theories translate into practical application." "I would enjoy that very much," she replied, and her smile seemed genuinely pleased rather than merely polite. As he made his way back to his own chambers, Davor reflected on how dramatically the evening had exceeded his expectations. Elenwyn was proving to be far more complex and interesting than her circumstances had suggested. The questions about her background remained, but they were beginning to feel less like potential threats and more like intriguing mysteries he wanted to solve. The next morning brought the practical details of relocating her to the North Tower rooms. Davor found himself supervising the process more closely than such a task warranted, ensuring that she had everything needed for comfort and convenience. When Marta mentioned that additional books might be appropriate for the rooms, he personally selected several volumes from his private collection, works on history, philosophy and poetry that he thought she might find engaging. "An unusual amount of attention for tribute," Commander Thane observed when he arrived for their daily military briefing. Davor looked up from the maps spread across his desk, noting the careful neutrality in his old friend's tone. "She's proving to be more interesting company than expected. Intelligence shouldn't be wasted." "Of course not," Thane agreed, "though the household is beginning to take notice of the special considerations." It was a gentle warning, and Davor acknowledged it. With a nod, he knew that his behavior was generating speculation and gossip. Such things were inevitable in any closely knit community. But for the first time in years, he found he cared less about appearances than about the prospect of continuing to explore whatever was developing between himself and the enigmatic woman who had arrived as tribute and was rapidly becoming something far more significant. The question was whether she felt the same growing connection, or whether her responses were simply the careful politeness of someone in a vulnerable position. Time, he supposed, would provide that answer. The castle's training yard occupied a large courtyard behind the main keep, surrounded by high walls that provided privacy for military exercises and weapons practice. Davor hadn't intended to go there that morning, but a message from Commander Thane about new recruitment protocols had drawn him toward the area just as dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. What he saw through the narrow window overlooking the yard stopped him completely. Elenwyn stood in the center of the practice area, moving through a series of sword forms with fluid precision that spoke of years of training. She'd acquired a practice blade from somewhere, probably charmed it away from one of the younger guards, and was working through complex combinations that required both strength and exceptional balance. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably those of someone with formal weapons training. Davor watched in fascination as she transitioned from defensive positions to offensive strikes, her technique revealing influences from multiple fighting traditions. This was not the casual familiarity with weapons that any frontier woman might possess for protection. This was the disciplined skill of someone who had received extensive martial education from masters who knew their craft. When she completed her routine and began to return the sword to its proper place, he made his way down to the courtyard. "Impressive," he said, stepping into the yard with genuine admiration in his voice. She spun around, clearly startled to discover she'd had an audience. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks as she offered a quick curtsy. "Your Majesty, I apologize. I didn't think anyone would be. I asked permission from the guard captain and he said—" "You asked permission to use the training yard?" Davor interrupted, more intrigued than concerned about protocol. "From Captain Morris?" "Yes, sir. I explained that I was accustomed to morning exercise and requested access to practice forms. He seemed to think it would be acceptable as long as I didn't interfere with regular training schedules." Morris was a practical man who'd served the castle guard for over a decade. The fact that he'd agreed suggested he'd recognized genuine skill. When he saw it, rather than simply indulging a newcomer's whim. Where did you learn to handle a blade like that? Davor asked, moving closer to examine the practice sword she'd been using. Again, that moment of hesitation he was beginning to recognize. My father believed daughters should be able to defend themselves, she said carefully. He arranged for instruction from local experts. Local experts. Another carefully chosen phrase that provided information while concealing specifics. Davor was beginning to understand that every conversation with Elenwyn involved this delicate dance between revelation and discretion. Your father seems to have held some progressive views about women's capabilities, he observed. He did, she agreed, and for the first time since he'd known her, her guard dropped enough to let genuine emotion show through. He said that strength and intelligence weren't limited by gender, only by opportunity and training. The pain in her voice when she spoke of her father was unmistakable, and Davor felt an unexpected urge to comfort her. Instead, he made another, impulsive decision that would have surprised anyone who knew his typically cautious nature. Would you care to spar? He asked. It's been some time since I've had an opponent with formal training rather than just battlefield experience. Her eyes widened in surprise. Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly... Why not? He asked, already selecting a practice blade of his own. You clearly have the skill, and I find myself curious about your technique. Consider it a form of conversation. Through combat. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the challenge with a smile that held both nervousness and excitement. Very well, but please don't hold back on my account. I dislike it when opponents underestimate me based on assumptions. The request proved unnecessary. From the moment they engaged, it became clear that Elenwyn possessed not only technical skill, but also strategic thinking and adaptability that made her a formidable opponent. She was smaller and lighter than Davor, but she used those differences to her advantage, employing speed and precision to counter his greater strength and reach. Their match drew a growing audience of guards and servants who found excuses to pass by the training yard. Davor was dimly aware of the attention, but found himself too engaged in the challenge to care about spectators. It had been years since he'd faced someone who could match his skill level while bringing a completely different fighting philosophy to bear. You favor the northern style, he observed during a brief pause to reset their positions. Among others, she replied, breathing hard but still maintaining perfect defensive posture. Adaptation requires understanding multiple approaches. They resumed the match, and Davor began to notice subtle techniques that spoke to influences from various regional schools. Whoever had trained her possessed knowledge that went far beyond what any single local expert would provide. This suggested resources, connections, and access to elite instruction that contradicted everything he'd been told about her background. When they finally called an end to the session, both breathing hard and sporting minor bruises, Davor felt more invigorated than he had in months. Physical challenge combined with intellectual engagement proved to be exactly what his restless energy had been craving. Thank you, Elenwyn said, returning her practice sword with a respectful bow. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of exercise. You're welcome to use the training yard whenever you wish, he replied, though I suspect you'll find no shortage of people wanting to test themselves against your skills once word spreads. Her expression grew thoughtful. Is that wise? I don't want to create complications for your household. It was a perceptive concern. A woman with exceptional martial abilities would indeed generate questions and speculation, particularly given her supposed background as displaced northern villager. But Davor found he cared less about potential complications than about ensuring she had outlets for her obvious talents and interests. Let people wonder, he decided. Anyone with your abilities shouldn't have to hide them for the sake of other people's expectations. As they walked back toward the main keep, Davor caught sight of Aldrich observing from a shadowed doorway. His spymaster's presence reminded him that investigations into Elenwyn's background were still ongoing. and that the questions raised by her demonstrated capabilities were becoming more rather than less significant. But looking at her now, animated by the morning's exercise, her defenses lowered enough to show genuine pleasure in their shared activity. He realized that he was beginning to care more about who she was becoming in his life than about whatever secrets her past might contain. The thought should have troubled him. As a king, he couldn't afford to let personal feelings override strategic considerations. But as a man who had spent decades prioritizing duty over desire, the possibility of something real and meaningful felt worth whatever risks it might entail. Time would tell whether that optimism proved justified or dangerously naive. The package arrived 3 weeks after Elenwyn's sparring session with Davor, delivered by a merchant caravan whose timing seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. Among the usual supplies and correspondence was a small, carefully wrapped bundle addressed simply to the king's household, with no indication of its specific intended recipient. Davor examined the package in his private study, noting the quality of the wrapping and the subtle elegance of the script. The outer covering bore no identifying marks beyond a small wax seal that depicted intertwined roses, a symbol he recognized but couldn't immediately place. Something about it tugged at his memory, suggesting familiarity with heraldic devices he'd encountered in diplomatic contexts. Inside, nestled in layers of fine silk, were several items that made his breath catch in recognition and understanding. Love letters, written in 2 different hands on paper that bore the watermarks of expensive stationers. The ink had faded slightly with age, but the emotions preserved in the carefully crafted words remained vivid and immediate. "My beloved Elena," began one letter in an elegant masculine script. "The council grows more insistent daily about the necessity of our separation, but they fail to understand that some bonds transcend political convenience. What we have built together, not merely as rulers, but as partners in every sense, cannot be dissolved by proclamations and threats." Davor's hands tightened on the parchment as he continued reading. The letter was signed with a flourish. "Forever. Yours, King Aldwyn of Ravenscroft." Ravenscroft. The name hit him like a physical blow. The northern kingdom that had been destroyed in a brutal succession war 15 years earlier, its royal family allegedly killed and its territories absorbed by competing neighbors. He'd been peripherally involved in that conflict, providing limited support to one of the claimant factions in exchange for favorable trade agreements. With growing dread, he opened another letter, this one in a feminine hand that he was beginning to suspect he would recognize. "Dearest heart," it read, "our daughter grows more beautiful each day, and I see your strength in her, even as she displays a stubborn independence that is entirely her own. She asks endless questions about the world beyond our borders, and I find myself torn between wanting to protect her innocence and knowing that she will need every advantage we can provide in the difficult times ahead. If the worst should happen, remember that we have prepared her as best we could. She has the knowledge and resources to survive whatever storms may come." The letter was signed, "With all my love, Queen Eleanor of Ravenscroft." Davor set the letters down with hands that weren't entirely steady. Elena of Ravenscroft had been renowned for her intelligence and diplomatic skill, as well as her remarkable red hair and green eyes. King Aldwyn had been equally famous for his progressive views on governance and his unconventional belief that royal women should receive the same education and training as their male counterparts. Their daughter would have been approximately 10 years old when the kingdom fell. A daughter who would now be 25, with red hair and green eyes, exceptional education, and martial training that reflected the finest instructors available to royalty. A daughter named Elenwyn. The final item in the package was a small piece of parchment with a brief message in the same script that had addressed the outer wrapping. "Some truths cannot remain hidden forever. Those who love her will act to protect what is rightfully hers." Davor stared at the words until they blurred, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Someone knew Elenwyn's true identity and was making sure he discovered it as well. But was this revelation meant as a gift, allowing him to understand the remarkable woman who had entered his life? Or as a threat, suggesting that her presence brought dangers he hadn't anticipated? The implications were staggering. If Elenwyn was indeed Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft, she wasn't simply a displaced noble. She was the rightful heir to a kingdom whose treasury had been legendary before its fall. More importantly, she represented a legitimate claim to territories that could shift the balance of power among multiple neighboring kingdoms, including his own. A soft knock interrupted his churning thoughts. "Come in," he called, hastily gathering the letters and tucking them into a secure drawer. Elenwyn entered, carrying a tea service and wearing the gentle smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. "Marta mentioned you'd missed lunch again," she said. "I thought you might appreciate some refreshment." Looking at her now, knowing what he knew, Davor could see resemblances he'd missed before. The graceful way she carried herself, the unconscious authority in her gestures, the effortless dignity that had nothing to do with learned behavior and everything to do with inherent breeding. She wasn't pretending to be noble. Nobility was simply part of who she was, as natural as breathing. "That's thoughtful of you," he managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. She poured tea with practiced elegance, her movements economical and precise. "You seem troubled," she observed. "Bad news in the morning's correspondence?" The irony of her question almost made him laugh, though there was nothing humorous about his situation. How did one tell a woman that you'd discovered she was not only royalty, but likely one of the wealthiest individuals on the continent, with legitimate claims to resources and territories that could reshape the political landscape of half a dozen kingdoms? "Nothing that can't be managed," he said, accepting the cup she offered and noting how her fingers brushed his briefly during the exchange. Even that simple contact sent warmth through him, a reaction that felt both more precious and more complicated given what he'd learned. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "about the challenges of balancing personal desires with broader responsibilities." The statement seemed particularly relevant now, and Davor wondered if she had any awareness of the brutal irony in her timing. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That perhaps the most important responsibility is being honest about who you truly are," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Deception might provide temporary protection, but it ultimately serves no one well." The words felt laden with meaning, beyond their surface content, and Davor found himself wondering if this conversation was as coincidental as her earlier arrival. Did she know that he'd discovered her secret? Was she testing his reaction or preparing to make revelations of her own? "Honesty can be dangerous," he said carefully. "Some truths carry risks that affect more than just the person revealing them." "True," she agreed. "But dishonesty carries its own dangers, and the longer deception continues, the more damage it can cause when the truth finally emerges, as it inevitably does." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken knowledge filling the space between them. Davor felt the familiar pull of attraction and affection, but now it was complicated by awareness of just how much was at stake beyond their personal feelings. "Elenwyn," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. She waited with the patient attention he'd come to associate with her, but something in her expression suggested she knew this wasn't a casual conversation. "If circumstances in your life were to change dramatically," he said finally, "what would matter most to you in determining how to respond?" The question was deliberately vague, but her answer came without hesitation. "The ability to make my own choices," she said, "and the certainty that the people I care about are safe and free to make their own choices as well." It was exactly what he'd hoped to hear, and exactly what made everything more complicated. because now he knew that whatever decisions lay ahead would need to honor both her autonomy and his growing love for her, even if those two priorities ultimately proved incompatible. Davor spent the following days in a state of careful observation, studying Elenwyn with new eyes while struggling to maintain the natural relationship they developed. The knowledge of her true identity created a constant tension between his growing personal feelings and the massive political implications of her presence in his stronghold. She seemed to sense his distraction, though she attributed it to the usual pressures of kingship rather than any specific crisis. During their evening conversations, which had become a treasured routine, she occasionally asked gentle questions about his mood, but never pressed when he deflected with vague references to administrative concerns. "You carry too much alone," she observed one evening as they sat in the castle's small private garden. The space was enclosed by high walls, providing privacy and protection while allowing access to fresh air and the soothing presence of growing things. Even the strongest leaders need trusted advisors to share the weight of difficult decisions. "I have advisors," Davor replied, though he knew that wasn't what she meant. "You have people who provide information and carry out orders," she corrected gently. "That's not the same as having someone you can speak with freely about your doubts and concerns." The irony of her statement struck him forcefully. Here was someone who could indeed provide that kind of partnership, someone with the intelligence, education, and perspective to understand the complexities of rule. But she was also someone whose very existence represented complications that could threaten everything he'd built. Over the past days, he'd been conducting his own discreet investigation into the fall of Ravenscroft, supplementing Aldrich's ongoing research with his own memories and historical records. The picture that emerged was both tragic and complex. King Aldwyn and Queen Elena had been genuinely beloved rulers who'd attempted to modernize their kingdom's social structures and diplomatic relationships. Their progressive policies had made them enemies among more traditional noble houses, both within their own kingdom and in neighboring territories. When a succession crisis arose, following Aldwyn's unexpected death from fever, various factions had moved quickly to eliminate what they saw as destabilizing influences. The official record stated that Queen Eleanor and her daughter had died during the siege of the capital, but Davor now suspected that Elena had managed to secure her daughter's escape, possibly with the help of loyal retainers who'd hidden the girl's identity and eventually delivered her to safety among the northern villages. The villages that had just surrendered her to him as tribute. "Davor," Elenwyn said softly, using his given name as she'd begun to do during their private moments. "Whatever is troubling you, perhaps sharing the burden would help." He looked at her sitting beside him in the garden's soft twilight and felt the full weight of his impossible situation. How could he tell her that he knew she was Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft, heir to a fortune that had been hidden away during her kingdom's fall? How could he explain that their developing relationship, which felt more real and meaningful than anything he'd experienced in years, was now complicated by political considerations that went far beyond personal preference? More troubling still, how could he be certain of his own motivations? Did his feelings for her remain unchanged, now that he knew she represented potential political advantages? Or had the knowledge of her wealth and status influenced his emotions in ways he wasn't ready to acknowledge? "There are times," he said carefully, "when personal desires and duty to the kingdom come into conflict, when the right choice as a man might be the wrong choice as a king." She was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on the climbing roses that grew along the garden's walls. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of understanding that suggested personal familiarity with such dilemmas. "My father once told me that the hardest decisions are often between two good choices rather than between good and evil," she said. He believed that in such cases, the decision itself mattered less than accepting full responsibility for whatever consequences followed. And if the consequences affect not just yourself, but everyone who depends on you, then you must weigh your responsibility to their welfare against your responsibility to your own integrity, she replied. But you cannot make that choice for others. You can only ensure that your own actions align with your deepest values and accept whatever follows. It was exactly the kind of counsel he might have expected from someone raised by King Alwyn and Queen Elena, thoughtful, principled, and grounded in both practical wisdom and moral clarity. The realization that she was unconsciously drawing on lessons from some of the finest rulers of their generation only reinforced both his admiration for her and his awareness of how much he stood to lose if their relationship couldn't survive. The revelations that were surely coming. "You speak as someone who has faced such choices," he observed. A shadow crossed her expression, and he saw her retreat slightly into the careful reserve that had been her initial defense. "I think everyone faces moments when they must choose between safety and authenticity," she said, "between protecting themselves and risking everything for something they believe in." The statement felt like both confession and challenge. Was she testing his willingness to accept risk for the sake of their connection? Or was she preparing him for revelations of her own? Before he could respond, Commander Thane appeared at the garden entrance with the kind of urgency that indicated significant developments. "Your Majesty," Thane said, his weathered face grim, "we've received reports of unusual activity along the southern border, armed groups moving toward our territory, though their intentions aren't clear." Davor rose immediately, his mind shifting to the tactical considerations such news demanded. But as he prepared to leave for strategic discussions with his military advisors, Elenwyn caught his arm. "Be careful," she said, her voice carrying an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Sometimes apparent threats are designed to distract from more immediate dangers. The warning felt specific rather than general, as if she possessed knowledge about current events that she shouldn't logically have, another piece of evidence supporting what he was increasingly certain was her true identity. "I'll keep that in mind," he promised, squeezing her hand briefly before following Thane toward what promised to be a long night of strategic planning. As they walked toward the war room, Davor found himself wondering if the timing of these border disturbances was coincidental or connected to Elenwyn's presence in his stronghold. If her identity was becoming known to others, it was possible that various factions might be positioning themselves to take advantage of the situation. The thought that she might be in danger and that his feelings for her might be putting both of them at risk added a new dimension of urgency to decisions that were already complex beyond anything he'd previously faced as a king. The attack came at dawn, swift and precisely coordinated in a way that spoke of extensive planning and inside knowledge of the castle's defenses. Davor woke to the sound of horns and shouts, the organized chaos of his guards responding to an assault that had somehow bypassed their outer perimeters. He armed himself quickly, his mind racing through defensive strategies as he made his way toward the main courtyard. The southern border reports had been a diversion, exactly as Elenwyn had warned. While his attention had been focused on potential external threats, enemies had moved into position much closer to home. Commander Thane met him in the armory, his expression grimmer than Davor had seen in years of shared campaigns. "They're not trying to take the castle," Thane reported. "This is a targeted extraction. They're moving directly toward the North Tower, toward Elenwyn's quarters." Terror, unlike anything Davor had experienced in decades of warfare, gripped his chest. This wasn't a random assault, or even a strategic attack on his stronghold. This was about her, and somehow his enemies had learned not only of her presence, but of her true value. "How many?" he demanded, checking the edge of his sword with practiced efficiency. 30, maybe 40. Professional soldiers, not raiders. They knew exactly where to breach the walls and which routes to take. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about the castle's layout and vulnerabilities. Someone with access to information that should have been available only to his most trusted advisors. They fought their way through corridors that had become battlegrounds, past familiar rooms now, littered with overturned furniture and broken glass. Davor's guards were holding their ground, but the attackers were skilled and determined. This wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a carefully orchestrated operation with specific objectives and prepared escape routes. When they reached the north tower, they found Elenwyn's door broken from its hinges and her rooms ransacked. But what stopped Davor's heart wasn't the evidence of struggle. It was what the attackers had left behind. Spread across her reading table were documents that made his blood run cold. Official proclamations declaring Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft to be alive and calling for her restoration to her rightful throne. Detailed financial records showing the location of treasure vaults that had been hidden before the kingdom's fall. Wealth sufficient to fund armies and rebuild entire territories. Most damning of all, a marriage contract bearing his own seal, though he'd never seen the document before in his life. A forgery, he breathed, studying the false agreement that purported to formalize a political alliance through matrimony. But Huldrych, who had appeared beside him with the silent efficiency of his profession, shook his head grimly. Not a forgery, Your Majesty. Someone with access to your seal created this document. The question is whether they intended it as evidence of treachery or as justification for what they've done. The implications were staggering. Either someone in his inner circle had betrayed him, or his enemies had become sophisticated enough to plant convincing evidence of political scheming that could justify everything from Elenwyn's kidnapping to a full-scale invasion of his territory. "Where is she?" Davor demanded. "Gone," Commander Thane reported from the window. "We can see riders moving east toward the mountain passes. They had fresh horses waiting. This was planned to the smallest detail." Davor stared at the documents, scattered across Elenwyn's table, his mind struggling to process the full scope of what had just occurred. The woman he'd grown to care for deeply had been revealed as Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft, and simultaneously taken from him by enemies who clearly intended to use her identity for their own purposes. But what chilled him most was a note written in elegant script that had been placed prominently among the other papers. "Your Majesty, by now you understand that the woman you know as Elenwyn carries bloodlines and resources that make her invaluable to those with proper vision. We have taken her into protective custody to ensure that such assets are not misused by those who would exploit her for personal gain. Her true identity demands that she be restored to her rightful position, and we are prepared to facilitate that restoration. Any attempt to interfere with our legitimate efforts will be interpreted as an act of war against the rightful crown of Ravenscroft." The letter was signed with a seal he recognized, Lord Commander Blackwood, one of the neighboring rulers who had suggested marriage alliances, and whose territories had expanded significantly following Ravenscroft's fall. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood hadn't simply stumbled upon information about Elenwyn's identity, he'd orchestrated her delivery to Davor's stronghold. The northern villages hadn't offered her as tribute out of desperation or ignorance. They'd been following instructions from someone who wanted her placed exactly where she could be discovered and rescued in a way that would appear legitimate. Davor had been manipulated from the very beginning. His growing feelings for Elenwyn turned into a weakness that his enemies could exploit, but had she been aware of the deception? Had her responses to him been genuine, or had she been acting a role designed to ensure his emotional investment in her fate? The questions burned in his chest as he stared at evidence of a conspiracy that went far deeper than he'd imagined. But beneath the anger and betrayal, one fact remained absolutely clear. Regardless of how they'd come to be in this situation, Elenwyn was now in the hands of people who saw her as a political tool rather than a human being. And that was something he could not, would not allow. "Prepare for pursuit," he ordered, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built his kingdom. "Full war party, provisioned for extended campaign. and send word to our allies. It's time to call in some favors." Commander Thane nodded grimly. "This could mean war, Your Majesty. Blackwood has significant resources and allies of his own." "Then war it is," Davor replied, buckling his sword belt with movements that spoke of deadly purpose. "But first, we're going to get her back." As his household mobilized for what might prove to be the most significant military action of his reign, Davor found himself facing a truth that cut through all the political complications and strategic considerations. His feelings for Elenwyn had become strong enough that he was willing to risk everything, his kingdom, his crown, perhaps his life, to ensure her safety and freedom. The question that remained was whether those feelings would survive whatever revelations awaited him about her role in the events that had brought them to this point. The war banner of Ravenscroft flew from the towers of Blackwood's mountain fortress, a sight that filled Davor with cold rage as he studied the stronghold through his spyglass. The burgundy fabric with its silver ravens seemed to mock everything that banner had once represented: honor, justice, and the enlightened rule that King Aldwyn and Queen Eleanor had embodied. Now it served as a prop in Lord Commander Blackwood's theatrical restoration of a princess who had no desire to be restored. "The intelligence was accurate," reported Captain Aldrich, crouched beside Davor among the rocks that provided cover for their scouting position. "She's being held in the Eastern Tower, under what they're calling protective custody, while preparations are made for her formal coronation." Davor lowered the spyglass, his jaw tightening at the bitter irony. Blackwood was styling himself as Elenwyn's protector and champion, the noble lord who had rescued a lost princess from the clutches of a barbaric king who would have exploited her for personal gain. The narrative was as carefully constructed as the military operation that had extracted her from Blackmoor's stronghold. "Casualties from the initial assault?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Light, considering the circumstances," Commander Thane replied from his position, coordinating with the other unit leaders. They were professionals who knew their business, surgical strikes designed to minimize resistance rather than maximize damage. 6 of our guards wounded, none killed. Almost as if they wanted to avoid giving you additional justification for retaliation. The observation was astute and troubling. Everything about this operation suggested planning that went far beyond simple kidnapping. Blackwood was positioning himself not as an aggressor, but as a liberator, someone acting in the best interests of a wronged princess and the noble cause of legitimate restoration. Over the past 3 days of hard riding through mountain terrain, Davor had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about his own motivations and actions. Had he been exploiting Elenwyn's vulnerable position? Had his growing feelings for her blinded him to her own desires and interests? Was it possible that she genuinely preferred restoration to her royal status over whatever relationship they'd been developing? The questions were made more urgent by intelligence gathered during their pursuit. Blackwood wasn't acting alone. He'd assembled a coalition of nobles and military leaders who had supported various claimants during Ravenscroft's succession crisis. More significantly, he'd somehow gained access to information about the hidden treasure vaults that represented Elenwyn's true inheritance. The wealth involved was sufficient to fund military campaigns, establish new kingdoms, or fundamentally shift the balance of power across multiple territories. "Your Majesty," said a voice behind him. Davor turned to see Sir Marcus, one of his most trusted knights, approaching with news that was clearly significant. "We've established contact with someone inside the fortress," Marcus reported quietly. "A servant who's been observing the situation and managed to get word to our forward scouts." Davor felt his pulse quicken. "And the Princess Elenwyn has refused to cooperate with the coronation ceremonies. She's demanding to speak with you directly, claiming that any restoration must be conducted according to her own choosing rather than imposed by others." Relief flooded through him at this evidence that she wasn't willingly participating in Blackwood's schemes. But the report also confirmed what he'd suspected. Her true identity was no longer secret, and the political implications were now unavoidable. "There's more," Marcus continued. "The servant reports that Lord Blackwood has been receiving regular communications from other territories. It appears that news of a surviving Ravenscroft heir has spread, and multiple factions are positioning themselves to take advantage of the situation. The strategic picture was becoming clearer and more dangerous. Elenwyn's restoration wouldn't simply affect her personal circumstances. It would trigger a reshuffling of alliances and territorial claims that could destabilize the entire region. Blackwood had likely anticipated this broader chaos and positioned himself to benefit from the resulting opportunities. "Recommendations?" Davor asked, turning to his assembled advisors. "Direct assault would be costly and potentially unsuccessful," Commander Thane said bluntly. "The fortress is well positioned and heavily defended. More importantly, any attack that resulted in harm to the princess would be used to justify retaliation. From Blackwood's allies, negotiation might be possible," suggested Lord Garrett, who had insisted on accompanying the expedition despite his age. "If Princess Elenwyn truly wishes to speak with you, there might be grounds for diplomatic resolution." Davor considered both options, weighing tactical advantages against political risks. A direct military assault would be satisfying, but potentially catastrophic. Diplomacy offered better prospects for Elenwyn's safety, but might also legitimize Blackwood's position as her protector and spokesman. "There's a third option," he said slowly, an idea taking shape that combined elements of both approaches. "We arranged the requested meeting, but on terms that demonstrate her freedom to choose her own path." He outlined his emerging plan to the gathered advisors, watching their expressions shift from skepticism to cautious approval as the strategy's merits became apparent. It was risky, possibly more dangerous than either direct assault or formal negotiation, but it offered the best chance of resolving the crisis in a way that honored both Elenwyn's autonomy and his own principles. As evening approached and his forces made final preparations, Davor found himself standing alone on a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of Blackwood's fortress. Torches were beginning to appear in the windows, and he could imagine the conversations taking place behind those stone walls. Political calculations, strategic discussions, and negotiations that treated Elenwyn as a valuable asset rather than a person with her own desires and rights. The realization that he might be guilty of similar thinking, that his own feelings for her were complicated by awareness of her political value, was deeply uncomfortable. But unlike Blackwood and the other opportunists gathering like vultures around this situation, Davor was prepared to give her the choice that truly mattered. The freedom to determine her own future, regardless of the personal cost to himself. Tomorrow would test whether his commitment to that principle could survive the confrontation that was surely coming. Win or lose, he would know that he'd acted with honor rather than mere calculation. The question was whether Elenwyn would choose to stand with him when the final accounting came. The meeting was arranged for midday in the courtyard of Blackwood's fortress, under terms that demonstrated either supreme confidence or remarkable foolishness on the part of both parties. Davor would be permitted to enter with a small honor guard, while Blackwood would present Princess Elenwyn in circumstances that allegedly proved her willing cooperation with the restoration. As Davor rode through the fortress gates, his father's sword at his side felt heavier than usual. The blade had been forged for a king who believed in direct action and personal courage, virtues that had built their kingdom but had also cost his father his life in battle. Now Davor faced a situation where those same principles might prove either salvation or destruction. The courtyard was crowded with witnesses, Blackwood's allies, minor nobles who had come to observe what they clearly expected to be a significant political moment, and enough armed guards to ensure that any deception would be costly. At the center of it all stood Lord Commander Blackwood himself, a man in his 50s, whose silver hair and dignified bearing might have been impressive if not for the calculating coldness in his grey eyes. Beside him, dressed in formal robes that bore the colours of Ravenscroft, stood Elenwyn, but the woman Davor saw was not the same person who had shared quiet conversations in his library and challenged him to sparring matches in the training yard. This Elenwyn held herself with regal bearing that spoke to her true heritage, her chin raised in defiance and her green eyes blazing with anger that was barely contained by royal protocol. "Your Majesty, King Davor," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. "We are pleased that you have come to witness this historic moment. May I present Her Royal Highness, Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft, rightful heir to the throne and treasures of her murdered parents." Elenwyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the reference to her parents' death, and Davor caught the flash of pain that crossed her features. Whatever game Blackwood was playing, he was using her deepest wounds as weapons in his political maneuvering. "Princess Elenwyn," Davor said, stepping forward with a formal bow that acknowledged her royal status, while maintaining his own dignity. "I am relieved to see you unharmed. I trust you have been treated with the respect due your station." "I have been treated as a valuable prize," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Lord Blackwood has been most attentive to ensuring my cooperation with his vision for Ravenscroft's restoration." The emphasis on cooperation made it clear that her presence here was anything but voluntary, despite the formal setting and ceremonial trappings. Blackwood's expression tightened slightly, but he maintained his diplomatic facade. "Her Highness understands the importance of proper procedure in matters of royal succession. The restoration of Ravenscroft requires careful attention to legitimacy and international recognition." "Indeed," Davor agreed, his tone carefully neutral. "Such matters are far too important to be rushed or conducted without the full consent of all parties involved." He met Elenwyn's eyes directly, seeing in them a mixture of hope, fear, and determination that made his chest tight with protective instincts. But he also saw something else, a subtle nod that suggested she understood what he was really asking and was prepared to make her own choice, regardless of the consequences. "Which brings us to the heart of the matter," Blackwood continued, clearly eager to maintain control of the proceedings. "Princess Elenwyn has graciously agreed to accept restoration to her throne, with appropriate support from those who recognize the legitimacy of her claim. Naturally, this includes access to the treasury that was preserved during the unfortunate period of occupation." The reference to Ravenscroft's fall as an unfortunate period of occupation was particularly galling, considering Blackwood's own role in the events that had destroyed the kingdom. But Davor forced himself to remain focused on the immediate situation rather than historical grievances. "Your Highness," he said, addressing Elenwyn directly, "such a momentous decision surely deserves to be made with full consideration of all available options. Perhaps you would benefit from hearing different perspectives before committing to any particular course of action." It was a careful way of asking whether she wanted him to fight for her freedom, but the question had to be framed in terms that wouldn't immediately precipitate violence. Elenwyn looked between Davor and Blackwood, her expression thoughtful, despite the tension radiating through every line of her body. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, even in the most difficult circumstances. "Lord Blackwood has presented compelling arguments about duty and legacy," she said, "but I find myself curious about alternative perspectives on what those concepts might require." The statement was diplomatically phrased, but its meaning was clear to everyone present. She was rejecting Blackwood's authority to speak for her interests and requesting the opportunity to make her own informed choice. Blackwood's facade finally cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath his careful courtesy. Your Highness, surely you understand that delay in this matter serves only those who would exploit your position for their own gain. King Davor has already demonstrated his willingness to treat you as tribute rather than royalty. Has he? Elenwyn asked, her tone sharp with contained fury. It seems to me that he treated me as an individual worthy of respect and consideration, while you have treated me as a political asset to be managed and displayed. Which approach better honors the memory of my parents and the principles for which they died? The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Davor realized that the moment of decision had arrived sooner than he'd expected. Blackwood's expression was turning murderous, and the armed guards were beginning to shift positions in ways that suggested preparations for violence. Davor's hand moved to rest on his sword hilt, not drawing the weapon, but making his readiness. Clear to everyone present, the tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as Blackwood abandoned all pretense of diplomatic courtesy. Enough of this charade, he snarled, his hand moving to signal his guards. Princess Elenwyn, you will accept restoration to your throne with my guidance, or you will be restored regardless of your preferences. The legitimacy of Ravenscroft's revival is too important to be left to the whims of someone who has clearly been influenced by her captors. But before his guards could move, Elenwyn stepped forward with the commanding presence that was her birthright. Lord Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with royal authority that made everyone present instinctively straighten. You speak of legitimacy while holding me prisoner. You invoke my parents' memory while betraying everything they believed about honor and justice. Most importantly, you presume to make decisions for Ravenscroft without understanding what Ravenscroft truly was. She reached into the folds of her formal robes and withdrew something that made Blackwood's face go pale. A signet ring that blazed with gold and rubies in the afternoon sunlight. My father's ring, she announced, holding it high. Enough for all to see. The symbol of royal authority that was thought lost when the capital fell. I have carried it for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was stolen from my family and my people. Davor felt his breath catch as understanding flooded through him. The hidden pendant he'd glimpsed, the careful way she'd deflected questions about her past. She hadn't been hiding from her identity. She'd been protecting it until she could choose the time and manner of its revelation. But restoration, she continued, her voice growing stronger, means rebuilding something better than what was destroyed, not simply recreating the same political structures that failed before. My parents died because they believed in progress and justice. I will not dishonor their memory by accepting a crown that comes through coercion and manipulation. Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. You stupid girl, he spat. Do you think your romantic notions matter when there are kingdoms to be won and fortunes to be claimed? You will cooperate, or you will be replaced by someone more amenable to practical necessity. The threat was explicit and deadly. But Elenwyn didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled with the kind of confidence that spoke to hidden reserves of strength. You assume I came here alone and defenseless? She said. That was your mistake. The courtyard erupted into chaos as figures in dark clothing appeared on the walls and rooftops. Davor's men, who had infiltrated the fortress during the distraction of the formal meeting. But more shocking still were the cries of "For Ravenscroft" that arose from among Blackwood's own guards as soldiers threw down their weapons and revealed themselves to be loyalists who had been waiting 15 years for their princess to return. The battle was brief, but decisive. Blackwood's hired mercenaries found themselves outnumbered and surrounded by fighters who possessed not only superior tactical positions, but also the fierce motivation that came from serving a cause they believed in rather than merely a paymaster. Davor fought his way through the melee toward Elenwyn, his father's sword cutting through opposition with the skill earned through decades of warfare. But when he reached her, he found that she had armed herself with a fallen guard's weapon and was holding her own against multiple attackers with the same deadly competence she demonstrated during their sparring sessions. "Behind you," she called, and he spun to counter a strike from one of Blackwood's remaining loyalists. Fighting side by side, they carved a path toward the fortress's main entrance, their movements coordinated with the instinctive understanding that came from perfect trust. Whatever questions remained about political implications and future arrangements, in this moment they were partners facing danger together. When the immediate threat was contained and Blackwood's remaining forces had either surrendered or fled, Davor found himself standing in a courtyard littered with the debris of battle, breathing hard and covered in sweat and blood that wasn't entirely his own. Elenwyn stood beside him, equally disheveled but unharmed, still holding her weapon with practiced ease. But what struck him most was the change in her expression. The careful guardedness was gone, replaced by the clear gaze of someone who no longer needed to hide who she truly was. "Princess Elenwyn of Ravenscroft," he said formally, offering a bow that acknowledged both her royal status and his respect for the courage she'd displayed. "Just Elenwyn," she replied, reaching out to touch his arm. "The titles and ceremonies can wait. Right now, I'm simply grateful to be free to make my own choices about what comes next." The touch was gentle, but significant, and Davor felt something settle in his chest that had been tense and uncertain for weeks. Whatever complexities lay ahead, and he knew there would be many, they would face them as equals who had chosen to stand together rather than as captor and tribute, or even as king and princess. Behind them, Commander Thane was efficiently organizing the securing of prisoners and the establishment of temporary control over the fortress. But Davor's attention was entirely focused on the woman beside him, and on the question that would determine everything that followed. "What happens now?" he asked. Elenwyn looked out over the courtyard where the banner of Ravenscroft still flew, but now it represented possibility rather than manipulation. "Now," she said, "we decide what we want to build together." 6 months later, Davor stood in the great hall of what had once been Blackwood's fortress, now transformed into something unprecedented, a shared seat of power that represented both the restored kingdom of Ravenscroft and his own expanded realm. The banners hanging from the stone walls displayed not conquest but partnership. His own black wolf alongside Elenwyn's silver ravens, symbols of two royal houses choosing unity over dominance. The coronation ceremony had been unlike any in recorded history. Rather than accepting restoration to a throne that existed only in memory, Elenwyn had insisted on creating something new, a joint monarchy that combined the progressive ideals her parents had died defending with the practical strength that had built Davor's kingdom. The crown they had forged together was a masterpiece of symbolic metalwork, her father's gold woven through with his father's iron, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either element could achieve alone. "The southern provinces have formally recognized the new arrangement," reported Lord Garrett, now serving as chief diplomatic advisor to both monarchs. "King Aldwyn's old allies are particularly pleased to see Ravenscroft's principles surviving in new form rather than being buried with old grievances." Davor nodded, though his attention was partly focused on Elenwyn, who was meeting with a delegation of merchants regarding trade routes that would benefit both their territories. Watching her navigate complex negotiations with the same intelligence and grace she brought to everything else still filled him with wonder at how completely his life had changed. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Integrating two different governmental systems required constant compromise and occasional heated discussions about everything from tax policy to military organization. Some of Davor's longtime advisors had struggled to accept sharing authority, while some of Elenwyn's restored supporters had initially questioned whether partnership diluted the purity of Ravenscroft's restoration. But the results spoke for themselves. The combined kingdom was more prosperous, more secure, and more just than either realm had been independently. The treasure vaults that Elenwyn had inherited provided resources for infrastructure improvements and social programs that benefited everyone, while Davor's military expertise and established administrative systems provided stability and protection. More importantly, their personal relationship had deepened through the crucible of shared responsibility. The careful dance of their early interactions had evolved into genuine partnership built on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and a love that had grown stronger through testing rather than weaker through revelation. The evening council session is ready to begin, Commander Thane announced, entering with the comfortable confidence of someone whose position had been enhanced rather than diminished by the new arrangements. His role as military coordinator for both kingdoms had proven both challenging and rewarding, and Davor could see the satisfaction in his old friend's weathered features. As they made their way toward the council chamber, Elenwyn fell into step. Beside Davor, their movements synchronized in the way that came from months of walking together through both literal and metaphorical battlefields. Lord Marcus reports that the northern reconstruction is ahead of schedule, she said, reviewing a parchment she'd been carrying. The villages that were damaged during the rebellion are not only rebuilt, but actually improved. Better roads, more efficient irrigation systems, and defensive capabilities that should prevent future problems. Davor smiled at the satisfaction in her voice. The restoration of her homeland's former territories had been one of their first major joint projects, and seeing those communities thrive under their combined leadership provided validation for all the risks they'd taken. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. This is exactly the kind of progressive governance he envisioned. The reference to King Aldwyn no longer brought the shadow of pain it once had. Through their months together, Elenwyn had found ways to honor her parents' memory while building something new, rather than simply trying to recreate the past. The healing that came from that integration was visible in her increased confidence and the easy way she now wore the authority she'd been born to wield. In the council chamber, they took their seats at a round table that had replaced the traditional high seat of singular monarchy. The arrangement was practical as well as symbolic. Every advisor and representative could see both rulers clearly, and discussions flowed more naturally when no one was literally looking up to authority. The evening's business covered the usual range of administrative matters, but also included reports on diplomatic initiatives that would have been impossible for either kingdom to pursue independently. Their marriage had created new possibilities for alliances and trade relationships, while their combined military strength deterred the kind of opportunistic aggression that had destroyed Ravenscroft the first time. "There is one final matter," Lord Garrett said as the formal session concluded. "The Eastern Kingdoms have proposed a regional conference to discuss standardizing trade currencies and establishing formal protocols for resolving territorial disputes. They've specifically requested that both your majesties serve as mediators, given your success in creating stability through cooperation rather than conquest." Davor exchanged glances with Elenwyn, seeing his own mixture of pride and anticipation reflected in her expression. The recognition that their approach to governance was influencing broader political developments felt like validation of everything they'd worked to achieve. "Accept the proposal," Elenwyn said, "but make it clear that we participate as partners, not as representatives of competing interests." As the council members departed and the great hall settled into evening quiet, Davor found himself alone with Elenwyn for the first time that day. The administrative demands of ruling two kingdoms left little time for private moments, making such opportunities precious. "Do you ever miss the simplicity?" he asked, settling into the comfortable chair beside the fireplace, where they often spent their few free minutes together. "The simplicity of what?" she replied, curling up in her own chair with the unself-conscious ease that had developed between them. are being just a king with straightforward problems. Rebellions to crush, territories to defend, decisions that affected only your own people. Elenwyn was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness he'd learned to expect from her. "I miss the illusion that problems could be straightforward," she said finally, "but I don't think they ever really were. We just had less information about their complexity." The observation was characteristic of her ability to find deeper truth in apparently simple situations. It was one of the qualities that made her not only a capable partner in governance, but also someone whose perspective consistently challenged him to think more clearly about difficult issues. "Besides," she added with a smile that carried mischief as well as affection, "would you really want to go back to dining alone and having no one to challenge you to sparring matches?" Davor laughed, remembering the solitary existence he'd accepted as the natural price of kingship before she'd entered his life like a force of nature disguised as tribute. "Never," he said, reaching for her hand and finding the familiar comfort of her fingers intertwining with his. "Though I still think you cheat when we spar. I prefer to think of it as creative tactical adaptation," she replied with mock dignity. Outside, the windows' lights were beginning to appear in the city below, evidence of lives being lived under the protection and prosperity that their partnership had created. It was a view that never failed to remind Davor of why the complexities and challenges were worthwhile. They had built something lasting together, something that honored both their individual histories and their shared vision for what leadership could accomplish. The empty, powerful king who had accepted tribute from defeated villagers was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that true strength came from choosing love over isolation, partnership over dominance. And sitting beside him, no longer hiding her identity or her capabilities, was the woman who had taught him that the best victories were the ones that transformed everyone involved, rather than simply defeating enemies. Their reign would face future challenges, their relationship would require continued effort and compromise, and their kingdoms would need constant attention to maintain the prosperity they'd achieved. But as Davor looked at their intertwined hands, he felt certain that whatever came next, they would face it together, as equals, as partners, and as two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they needed.